The North Sea Observatory at Vlieland detects faint distortions, not in light, but in the gravitational background. Years before, humanity believed it had eradicated the invaders. The records of that war remain classified, sanitized into myth. Yet, the distortions echo the old signatures. Something is returning. The midnight sky above Rotterdam gleamed with its usual web of satellites, faint specks drifting between the constellations. To most, they were invisible, irrelevant, just background machinery. But to Dr. Jeroen van Dijk, crouched over the console of the North Sea Monitoring Array, they were all that mattered. The data stream unfolded in endless strings, positional coordinates cascading in green. Jeroen frowned. Again. A cluster of civilian communication satellites in low orbit had shifted in ways no perturbation could explain. Not gravitational anomalies, not solar wind drag, not debris collision. Instead, they had traced a strange sequence of displacements, subtle zigzags as if choreographed. He ran the comparison. His hands shook as he overrode the restricted firewall with an encryption key given to him years ago by a dying professor, his father's closest friend. The sealed folder bore a bland name, Project Grensline. The overlay snapped into place. The orbital irregularities matched exactly with a pattern logged during the First War, the one nobody admitted had ever happened. A memory pierced him, unbidden. His father, Willem van Dijk, once a defense consultant, whispering from a hospital bed. We won, but the victory was only an intermission. Jeroen pushed the memory aside and focused. The match wasn't merely in coordinates but in structure. The satellites were being tugged into the edges of a vast, invisible shape. A fractaline geometry, a construct that existed partly in orbital space, partly in a dimension unmeasurable by human instruments. The invaders had used it before, a staging lattice. Every displaced satellite was a node, like beads strung on an invisible web. Once complete, the geometry could compress spacetime locally, forming transit corridors. They were rebuilding their gateway. A sudden alarm ripped through the array chamber. On the external feed, one of the observation drones launched from Rotterdam's harbor to track orbital debris shuddered violently. Its stabilizers spun out of control, metal groaning against stresses unseen. Control override. Jeroen barked, fingers flying over the console. He fought to stabilize the drone. For a second it responded, then its cameras relayed a blurred image, the sky above Rotterdam folding like glass under pressure. A shimmer, faint but definite, ran across the stars. Then the drone imploded. Not an explosion but a collapse, its structure crushed inward until it vanished in a burst of static. Jeroen staggered back. His colleagues shouted, alarms bleeding. The system registered the loss as impact with unknown field. He ignored the bureaucracy of error codes and stared at the afterimage on the screen. The same effect had been recorded in the secret logs of Project Grensline. The geometry was not just scaffolding. It consumed matter in order to reinforce itself. Every vanished drone, satellite, or vessel became part of the alien lattice. Moments later, the city below seemed to react. Lights along the Erasmus Bridge flickered as if power were being siphoned. In the harbor, cranes froze mid-motion, their guidance systems knocked out by satellite disruptions. Traffic snarled, horns blaring. The irregularities above were bleeding into everyday life. A deep vibration passed through the array's foundation. The instruments translated it as gravitational resonance, waves propagating from above. The geometry was anchoring itself to the earth. Emergency evacuation, someone yelled. Jeroen, however, stayed. He typed furiously, feeding the array's last stable readings into a makeshift predictive model. If the geometry continued, the orbit around Earth would fracture into zones of unstable time dilation. Navigation, communication, even simple orbits would disintegrate. Humanity's entire satellite infrastructure would collapse in days. He paused only when another image filled the screen, a satellite's live camera feed, seconds before distortion shredded it. Through the lens, Rotterdam gleamed far below. And hovering just beyond atmosphere, faintly visible, a curve of alien architecture. Not a ship, but a fragment of the fractaline geometry itself, shimmering like an ice crystal the size of a continent. Jeroen whispered the words his father had left him. An intermission. But now the curtain was rising again. The fractaline geometry is not a ship or weapon, but an extra-dimensional scaffold, a network projected into orbit using existing satellites and debris as anchors. Structure. Fractal and recursive. Each visible node is only a fragment. The whole extends into higher dimensions. Function. Forms gateways by synchronizing regions of distorted time. Assimilates matter, collapsed objects are re-indexed into the lattice. Extracts energy by channeling gravitational differentials. Observation. Detected only indirectly, orbital drift, implosions without explosions, crystalline arcs in the sky. Purpose. Not conquest but evaluation. The First War was an experiment. Humanity's resistance was measured, not defeated. Implication. The geometry cannot be destroyed, only delayed. To resist it is to resist mathematics itself. The quiet of Marieke de Boer's coastal home at Scheveningen was broken by the crunch of tires on gravel. She closed the worn naval logbook in her lap, the entries barely legible after decades. She had read them hundreds of times, yet they never brought clarity, only contradictions. Some pages contained details she did not remember writing. A knock. Not polite but firm, rhythmic. Two men in dark coats stood at her door, their manner too precise to belong to ordinary officials. They introduced themselves only as from The Hague. No agency, no insignia. She noticed the bulge of secure comms units at their belts. Commander de Boer, the taller one said, voice clipped. We need to speak about your service record. Specifically, about the incident in lunar orbit 29 years ago. Marieke felt her throat dry. They shouldn't know that. They erased it. Her vision swam. For a moment she was not in her living room but back in the command deck of the Zeven Provinciën, Earth's first orbital defense cruiser. The lunar horizon shimmered, alien distortions unfolding like ribbons across space. Then, blankness, a chasm of lost time. When her sight cleared, she was on her couch again. The men were watching, expressionless. I don't remember, she whispered. But her mouth betrayed her. Words spilled out unbidden, pulled from some hidden script written deep in her mind. Round 2 was always inevitable. The agent stiffened. One tapped a note onto his pad. The other leaned forward. Who told you that, Commander? Her pulse hammered. No one told me. It was placed there. Marieke recalled fragments of the alien war strategy. Not weapons of fire but weapons of memory. The invaders had seeded neural distortions across combatants. Memory reefs. These were crystalline fields of thought lodged in the human brain, dormant until triggered. When activated, they steered speech, suppressed recollections, even overwrote timelines. Humans had not forgotten the First War. They had been edited. Before she could respond further, the air in the room pulsed. Her glass table cracked. The comms units on the agent's belts shrieked with static. Field interference, one barked, grabbing her arm. Through the window, Marieke saw the impossible. A dark ripple crawling along the North Sea horizon, as if the ocean were rising into vertical planes of water. It was not a wave but a fracture, light bending against an invisible geometry. The shorter agent drew a compact rail pistol. Move. The wall behind them buckled inward without sound, drywall collapsing like paper. A shard of nothingness hung in the air, a sliver of the memory reef, bleeding from higher space into her home. The agents opened fire, rail slugs whistling through the anomaly. Each impact bent away at unnatural angles, the bullets never touching their mark. Marieke felt the pressure in her head intensify. The reef wasn't attacking her body but her mind. Memories surged unbidden, orders given, fleets erased, comrades screaming in lunar orbit. She remembered everything for a heartbeat. Then her recollections were ripped away again, leaving only fragments. She fell to her knees, clutching her head. Round two, she muttered, unable to stop. The taller agent seized her arm, hauling her up. We're extracting. Now. They dragged her into the driveway just as the house's foundation folded in on itself, devoured silently by the alien intrusion. Within seconds, her past, her home, her stability, gone. As they sped toward The Hague in a nondescript black vehicle, Marieke looked back at the shrinking ruin of her home. She knew then the war had never ended. It had only retreated into their minds. The elevator sank far below the streets of The Hague, deeper than the city's known infrastructure. Peter Hoffman clutched the handrail, suppressing unease as the fluorescent light trembled overhead. He had been told the vault was Onderlag, the underlayer, a classified archive hidden since the First War. When the doors opened, the air was dry, metallic, preserved. Rows of armored cases lined the chamber, each tagged with dates redacted in thick black ink. Soldiers in matte black armor flanked the corridor, their rifles more ceremonial than practical. If what lay here awakened, bullets would mean little. Dr. Karen Voss, the vault's curator, guided Peter inside. You're here because the anomalies above Rotterdam match the old patterns, she said. To understand what's coming back, you must understand what we tried to bury. She led him to a glass enclosure. Inside, suspended by magnetic fields, floated shards of metal unlike any terrestrial composition. They shimmered with colors no spectrum analyzer could classify, shifting between transparency and opacity as if undecided whether to exist at all. These fragments were collected from wreckage in lunar orbit, Karen explained. Every analysis collapses under contradiction. Atoms arrange themselves in Euclidean lattices one moment, then in non-Euclidean configurations the next. It's as if the material is solving equations in real time. Peter leaned closer. The shards pulsed faintly, rhythmically. "They're thinking," he whispered. The alloys were not inert debris. They were adaptive matter, self-adjusting substrates that shifted their internal geometry to optimize survival within any environment. Energy weapon? It diffused heat. Acid? It rearranged to neutrality. Attempted disassembly? It fragmented into patterns smaller than instruments could track, then recombined moments later. But most disturbingly, adaptive matter mirrored its observers. Microscopes reported geometries similar to human optical pathways. Scans with neural signatures produced patterns resembling memory synapses. "The more we look," Karen said, lowering her voice, "the more it learns how we look. The alloy adapts to perception." An alarm split the chamber. The containment fields around one shard flickered. Guards raised rifles as the shard shivered violently, pulsing brighter. "Field collapse," a technician shouted. The shard shot downward, striking the vault floor. Instead of shattering, it liquefied and spread, thin filaments racing across the tiles like living mercury. They branched with terrifying speed, tracing geometrical webs across the chamber. "Seal it," Karen barked. The guards opened fire. Rail slugs punched into the spreading web, but the alloy absorbed each impact, bending the bullets into harmless spirals that clattered to the floor. The filaments climbed the walls, wrapping armored cases, probing locks as if searching for companions. Peter stumbled back, but something compelled him to look directly into the liquid metal. Shapes swam within, forming and reforming, orbital trajectories, fractal lattices, and horribly, faces. His father's face, serene, whispering the same phrase Marique had spoken. Round 2 was always inevitable. The technicians surged forward with portable magnetic clamps. A blast of blue containment energy crackled, forcing the alloy back into a shrinking pool, then into stasis. For now. Karen wiped sweat from her brow. "You see now why underlag exists. The wreckage wasn't wreckage. It was residue. And it remembers everything we tried to forget." Peter looked once more at the pulsing shard behind the reinforced glass. He realized the truth. The geometry above Rotterdam wasn't just rebuilding. It was calling its scattered fragments home. Delft University's deepest sublevel was not listed on any architectural plans. Access required not only clearance but an escort by armed guards whose boots echoed in the empty halls. Dr. Jeroen van Dijk had been summoned here without explanation, his presence requested by the Ministry of Defense. He recognized the signs of old secrecy: steel doors over rusting hinges, corridors that looked hastily repurposed. And at the end of the hallway, a chamber that did not look human at all. Inside, encased in concentric rings of inert shielding, stood the Spiegel, the mirror. It was neither satellite nor collider. A vast circular frame, 30 meters across, held in suspension by magnetic rails. Within the frame hung a translucent surface like frozen water, rippling faintly though no air stirred. Every instrument pointed at it failed to agree on its shape. Some saw a flat plane, others a curved lens, others a space that did not exist at all. "Reverse engineered from lunar wreckage," explained Professor Annelies Kuiper, chief engineer. "We only built half of what the design suggested. The rest was incomprehensible." De Spiegel was designed to exploit what researchers had called reflection physics. Instead of generating force directly, the machine captured local conditions, energy, gravity, even causality, and reflected them back into the system, amplified and inverted. Like a mirror held up to the laws of nature. Activate it near heat and it produced localized cold. Test it with gravity, and it generated anti-gravitational vectors. But beyond these small demonstrations, no one dared to engage the full system. "Too unstable," Kuiper said. "The calculations suggest resonance at planetary scale. A misfire could tear Europe apart." As if to confirm her warning, the chamber lights flickered. One of the graduate engineers cried out. "External interference. Something's coupling with the core." On De Spiegel's surface, the ripple thickened into patterns, geometric arcs nearly identical to the fractaline geometry in orbit. Somehow, the alien structure was resonating with the unfinished machine. Jeroen watched in horror as the machine began to activate on its own. Instruments screeched, magnetic locks shuddered. A beam of distorted light shot from the mirror and carved across the chamber, slicing through steel scaffolding without heat or sound. The metal simply fell apart, its bonds undone. "Shut it down," Kuiper yelled. The engineers scrambled. Control panels sparked. The mirror's surface bulged outward like a bubble, threatening to rupture. For a split second, Jeroen glimpsed through it, not into Delft but into something else. A vast lattice stretching into infinity, crystalline arcs spanning a void where stars bent like liquid. Then the vision collapsed. The containment field slammed back into place with a thunderclap that shook the building. Silence. Smoke drifted across the ruined scaffolding. No one moved for a long time. Finally, Kuiper spoke, voice hoarse. "They built this. Or rather, they wanted us to build it. A resonance chamber tuned to their geometry. Maybe as a weapon, maybe as a gateway. We never asked if finishing it would save us, or just invite them back." Jeroen's chest tightened. He realized the invaders did not need to send new fleets. They only needed humanity to complete what they had left behind. Der Spiegel was not a defense. It was the second act waiting to be triggered. The Wadden Sea was calm that night, the horizon silver under the rising moon. For centuries, Dutch trawlers had worked these waters, their nets combing through tides as predictable as breathing. Captain Arjen Vermeer leaned against the rail of the Noordzee II, cigarette glowing in the dark, when the sea itself seemed to falter. It began with silence. The drone of the diesel engine thinned, as though the sound were being absorbed by the air. The waves flattened. Every ripple vanished until the boat sat on a glassy expanse, perfectly still. "Captain?" a deckhand called, pointing toward the horizon. The water was folding upward. Not like a wave, but as though the sea had struck a pane of invisible glass and begun climbing it. Vertical planes of liquid rose higher and higher, defying gravity, enclosing the trawler like walls of a tank. What the crew saw was not water behaving as fluid, but water obeying a different geometry. The invaders' technology manipulated the phase state of liquid mass, forcing it into structures that refracted not light but space itself. The phenomenon, later called a hydrostatic lens, served two purposes: to bend spacetime corridors downward, linking sea level directly to orbital geometry; to harvest mass, ships, seawater, even living beings, as stabilizing material for the larger lattice forming overhead. The Noordzee II's nets, still trawling, snapped taut, then were pulled skyward into the vertical wall of water. The winches screamed, metal struts bending until bolts flew like bullets across the deck. Crewmen scrambled, one flung into the impossible wall, only to vanish as if he had stepped into another dimension. No splash, no body. "Cut the nets." "Cut them?" Arjen roared. But the ropes no longer connected to water. They connected to the geometry itself. The trawler shuddered as its bow rose from the sea, lifted by invisible force. From shore, radar operators in Harlingen watched in disbelief as 5 trawlers blinked from screens in the span of 2 minutes. No SOS, no wreckage, just silence. On Texel Island, a fisherman's family saw it. A bright shimmer above the sea, like the aurora borealis turned vertical, swallowing vessels whole. One boy recorded with his phone until the screen fractured into static. His final frame showed a trawler half dissolved, the stern intact while the bow already geometrically absent. By dawn, only waves remained. No debris, no oil slicks, no survivors. At Delft, when Jeroen received the report, he stared at the grainy radar printouts. The hydrostatic lens was not an attack. It was a calibration, a method of aligning Earth's oceans with the fractaline geometry above. The sea had been chosen not as battlefield but as building material. Humanity had always imagined invaders would arrive with fleets of fire and steel. Instead, they returned with mathematics, and used the planet itself as construction matter. Marieke de Boer sat strapped into a steel chair beneath the interrogation lamps of a bunker outside The Hague. 2 days had passed since her home was consumed by the anomaly. Her wrists bore faint burns where the field had touched her skin. Government interrogators had demanded a testimony she could not give, because her memories came in fragments, cut into ribbons. One moment lunar orbit, the next blankness, then screams that belonged to voices she no longer recognized. "I told you already," she said hoarsely. There was a battle. And then nothing. The agents exchanged looks. They pressed a device against her temple, a cognitive resonance scanner. A lattice of light mapped her neural pathways onto a screen. But instead of clear patterns, the feed flickered with sharp discontinuities, like a file corrupted beyond repair. And then, unexpectedly, the corruption itself began to move. The scans revealed foreign structures woven into Marique's mind. They were not implants but cognitive parasites, self-sustaining patterns of thought seeded during the First War. Each parasite was a knot of memory that could suppress or overwrite surrounding neurons, not only editing perception but rewriting consensus reality. The parasites were networked. Her thoughts were not hers alone. They resonated with others infected across the globe, ensuring entire populations shared the same gaps. Human history had not been forgotten. It had been replaced. The agents demanded specifics. And this time the parasite faltered. Marique saw it again. The Zevon Provincian in lunar orbit, her ship at the vanguard of humanity's hidden fleet. Alien distortions bloomed like flowers across the stars. She remembered firing rail salvos into geometrical arcs that refused to break, remembered comrades screaming as entire destroyers were folded into points of light. The war had not been won by victory. It had been ended by erasure. Survivors were infected with cognitive parasites, their memories rewritten so the world would never know the cost. Her voice shook as she spoke. They didn't retreat. They edited us. We're living in a narrative they designed. Suddenly the scanner screen erupted in violent static. Marique convulsed, slamming against her restraints. The parasites in her mind had detected exposure. The bunker's lights flickered. Agents rushed to hold her down, but a pulse rippled outward, not electromagnetic but cognitive. Several interrogators froze mid-step, eyes glazing. They began repeating in perfect unison. Round 2 was always inevitable. Marique screamed. She could feel her thoughts being pulled outward, resonating with the infected men. For a heartbeat she shared their perception. A lattice of human minds stretched across the earth, each one a node in the invaders' experiment. The geometry was not just orbital. It was cognitive. The agents drew pistols, not at her but at each other, command hierarchies collapsing under contradictory implanted commands. Gunfire erupted, ricocheting in the steel chamber. Marique's restraints snapped as an agent collapsed onto the controls. She staggered free, ears ringing. The infected men continued chanting, their words synchronized like a broadcast signal. She fled into the corridor, alarms blaring. Guards converged, confusion spreading as the chant echoed from multiple throats. For every soldier trying to contain the incident, another turned glassy-eyed and repeated the phrase. Marique pushed past them, running upward into the night air. The moon hung low over The Hague, cold and indifferent. And in its pale light, she remembered with clarity she could no longer deny. She had fought there. She had lost everything there. And she had been turned into a weapon of forgetting. The memory war had never ended. It had simply gone underground, buried not in bunkers but in the minds of those who survived. In a sealed laboratory beneath Delft, Peter Van Loon bent over the shards of alien alloy retrieved from the subterranean vault. The fragments looked inert, matte gray metal, cool to the touch. But under the electron microscope, their surfaces rippled with recursive geometries that changed between observations, as if the material refused to hold still under human scrutiny. He had tested them with every instrument available: spectrometers, quantum interference probes, even particle accelerators. Each yielded only noise until he tried something primitive, feeding the raw interference patterns into a neural array designed for climate simulations. The machine crashed, then rebooted itself, then began to calculate. The alloys were not tools or weapons. They were physical algorithms. Each fragment was a lattice encoding equations, not carved but embodied in its very structure. When exposed to computation, they forced machines into alignment, reconfiguring them into solvers for problems far beyond human design. What problems? That was the terror. Peter's screen filled with models of Earth, coastlines, cities, supply chains, military installations, all rendered with breathtaking precision. He saw the vanishing trawlers in the Wadden Sea replayed as projections days before they occurred. He saw Rotterdam darken beneath arcs of crystalline fire, simulations branching like trees of doom. The alloys weren't just simulating reality. They were predicting collapse. Alarms screamed through the Delft facility. Security feeds flickered, black-suited operatives stormed the building. Peter's fingers froze above the keyboard. He knew these weren't ordinary government agents. They moved too fluidly, their faces too blank, their voices repeating fragments of the chant. Round 2 was always inevitable. The parasites had infiltrated the security apparatus. Peter yanked the alloy shard from its cradle, shoving it into a lead-lined case. The machine fought back, screens fracturing into cascading warnings. Process incomplete. Projection chain disrupted. The intruders entered the lab. One raised a weapon. Peter hurled the case into a radiation vault and slammed the magnetic lock. Bullets shattered glass, tearing through consoles. Sparks ignited, filling the chamber with the acrid stench of burning circuits. He dove behind a steel table, heart pounding. If they got the alloy, humanity would never even glimpse its own future before it ended. He triggered the emergency purge. Sirens wailed as halon gas flooded the chamber. One of the intruders staggered, choking, while the others moved with eerie calm, seemingly immune. Peter crawled toward the exit, clutching the backup drive where fragments of the predictions had been stored. A round clipped his shoulder, searing pain, but adrenaline kept him moving. He slammed the bulkhead shut behind him, sealing the chanting figures inside. The last thing he heard as he stumbled into the night air of Delft was their unified, echoing cry. The calculations are complete. Blood soaking through his shirt, Peter pressed the drive to his chest. He knew the truth now. The alloys were not relics, they were instruments of foresight. And in their models, humanity was already defeated. The Binnenhof in The Hague, seat of Dutch governance, had been fortified since the first whisper of orbital irregularities. Armed guards flanked the parliamentary hall, though their eyes betrayed exhaustion, and sometimes something worse. Inside, Prime Minister Saskia van Alphen sat at the head of a long oak table. Around her, generals, ministers, and advisors murmured over documents Peter had barely managed to smuggle out of Delft. The predictions drawn from the alloys were spread before them in printed sheets. Maps streaked with projected destruction, timelines converging on a single certainty: collapse. Rotterdam erased in 36 days, murmured Defense Minister Koster. Utrecht in 40. The projections even account for civilian traffic flows. They know us better than we know ourselves. Saskia's fingers tightened around her pen. Are these predictions or instructions? No one answered. As debate turned to chaos, Saskia noticed subtle shifts in her ministers. Minister of Health raised his hand to speak, but his phrasing seemed wrong. Too measured, too empty. General Rietveld argued for immediate evacuation of the northern provinces, but when pressed for details he repeated his points in identical words, like a recording caught in a loop. It dawned on her. These were not ordinary men. They wore masks of cognition, infiltration constructs seeded into the brain, mimicking personality while hollowing out volition. The host's memories remained intact, but their decision-making had been overlaid by alien logic. The masks did not scream their presence. They waited, subtle, until crucial decisions surfaced. Then they tilted the balance. Peter, pale and bandaged, leaned against the wall, barely able to stand. "Look at them," he croaked. "Don't you see? The war isn't coming. It's already inside us." General Rietveld slammed his fist against the table. "Paranoia. The alloys are psychological warfare. Fear is their weapon." But Saskia had caught it, the faint delay before his words, the mechanical rhythm of his speech. She recalled the bunker incident, the chanting agents. Her chair scraped back. "General," she said coldly, "recite the first line of the anthem." His lips parted. The pause was longer this time. He began to sing, voice steady, until it faltered midline, collapsing into silence. His expression remained calm, but his eyes, dead glass. Panic erupted. Half the ministers leapt to their feet, shouting accusations. Guards raised weapons. But Saskia already knew, at least 3 others around the table were masked. The chamber descended into chaos. Masked ministers moved in eerie synchrony, lunging for weapons with reflexes too precise. Gunfire echoed beneath the stained glass windows. Real guards fought imposters in brutal close-quarter combat, grappling, knives flashing, the ancient oak table splintering under the violence. Saskia dragged Peter behind a marble pillar. His blood left smears along the floor. "The masks are coordinated," he gasped. "They're executing the alloy's predictions, forcing us into collapse." She fired the pistol she'd drawn from a fallen guard. A masked advisor dropped, not even trying to evade, as if statistics had already accounted for his death. Another advanced, smiling faintly until 2 soldiers tackled him into a wall, cracking his skull open like porcelain. And then silence, broken only by the moans of the dying. Only 6 of the council remained breathing, Saskia among them. Her once stable government had imploded in a single meeting. Peter pushed a blood-stained folder into her hands. Within were fragments of the alloy's calculations, still incomplete, but enough to glimpse the scale. Not just cities, nations, alliances, humanity itself. "They aren't invading us," he whispered. "They're guiding us, to destroy ourselves on schedule." Saskia stared at the survivors, their faces pale, eyes darting with distrust. Which of them still wore masks? Which were already compromised? The answer didn't matter. The room smelled of gunpowder and inevitability. She remembered her oath of office. She would lead, but now she realized she might be leading into a future that had already been calculated, down to her final breath. The mask was not a disguise. It was governance itself, rewritten. The Wadden Sea had been under surveillance since the first trawlers vanished. Satellites recorded faint arcs of light beneath the waves, shifting like veins of crystal in deep stone. The Dutch Navy dispatched 3 frigates and a carrier group, reinforced by NATO allies, to hold the line. From the deck of the HMS Tromp, Commander Annika Voss scanned the horizon. Gray water stretched in all directions, the sky thick with autumn storms. On her radar, shapes flickered, contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts. False returns, her technician muttered. Voss wasn't so sure. At 15:42 hours, the ocean fractured. Not waves, not explosions. Fractures as if reality itself split into geometric planes. Jagged crystalline ridges erupted from the sea, rising hundreds of meters, glimmering with inner light. These were hydrofractals, extensions of the fractaline geometry, using seawater as substrate. The ridges grew faster than any geological process should allow, locking ships into corridors of impossible symmetry. Radar was useless, compasses spun madly. And then the water rose. Massive vortices pulled frigates sideways, slamming hulls against glittering walls. Some vessels split neatly in two, their wreckage absorbed into the crystalline lattice, vanishing without splash. The carrier launched its jets. F-35 screamed overhead, dropping missiles into the hydrofractals. Explosions flared, but the geometry absorbed them, flames freezing mid-bloom before collapsing into points of light. Voss ordered full batteries to fire. Naval guns roared, shells streaking into the ridges. For a moment, the sea itself seemed to shatter. Then the fragments reassembled, the lattice reforming like a wound closing over bone. "Targets indestructible," a lieutenant shouted. But the geometry was not passive. Shafts of refracted light lanced upward from the crystalline towers, striking jets mid-flight. Pilots screamed as their controls inverted, aircraft twisting into impossible spirals before imploding silently. The USS Franklin Pierce, NATO's flagship, was caught in the center of a vortex. Its vast bulk tilted, dragged toward a rising spire. Voss watched through binoculars as the carrier's deck split, jets sliding like toys into the abyss. For a heartbeat, thousands of sailors stood exposed against the stormy sky. Then the spire swallowed the ship whole. Not wreckage. Not oil slick. Nothing remained. Panic spread across the comms. Half the fleet retreated, the rest firing blindly. Voss clenched her fists. "If we scatter, we're finished. Form a wall and concentrate fire." But the order came too late. The hydrofractals pulsed as one, sending a resonance through the water. Every ship's electronics died at once. Engines cut. Screens went black. The fleet drifted, powerless, into the lattice. As the Tromp lurched, Voss was thrown against the rail. In the kaleidoscope of refracted light, she glimpsed something, forms moving within the hydrofractals. Not ships, not creatures, but configurations. Recursive machines folding into themselves, patterns of invasion made manifest. And then the sea roared back. The lattice collapsed as suddenly as it had risen. Shattered ships floated in smoking ruin. Survivors clung to debris under a bruised sky. Only 5 vessels remained afloat. The rest were gone. The North Sea was no longer an ocean. It was an operating theater. And the geometry had just finished its first incision. Rotterdam had been emptied in haste. Columns of evacuees streamed along highways toward the interior, their faces gray with exhaustion. Sirens wailed without pause. From the Euromast, Prime Minister Saskia van Alphen surveyed her city for what might be the last time. The skyline still bore scars from wars past, but tonight it stood against something no history could prepare for. Beside her, Peter Van Loon leaned heavily on a cane, clutching the alloy drive to his chest. "The alloys predicted this," he said, voice ragged. "Every roadblock, every failed evacuation corridor, every ship lost at sea. We are living inside the proof." Saskia's knuckles whitened against the railing. "Then let us be the error." At 22:17 hours, the sky fractured. Points of crystalline light appeared in perfect alignment above the port. They connected, forming terminal geometry, a final configuration of the invader's lattice, spanning from orbit to ocean. It was neither fortress nor weapon, but a harvesting grid, calibrated to collapse entire cities into informational constructs. The air thickened as though every breath had weight. Windows shattered. Concrete vibrated until dust poured from its pores. Rotterdam itself had become a resonator. Dutch and NATO artillery opened fire. Rail batteries on the Maasvlakte spat glowing projectiles into the sky. For an instant the lattice faltered. One node fractured, cascading shards across the night like dying stars. Soldiers cheered. Then the shards reassembled, stronger, completing the pattern. F-35s roared overhead, their exhaust flames cutting across the grid. One fighter rammed directly into a node, detonating in a flash that turned night to day. The lattice dimmed, but did not break. On the moss bridges, tanks fired until their barrels glowed white. Infantry unleashed everything they had, their gunfire swallowed by shimmering arcs. Every act of defiance bought seconds. Nothing more. The terminal geometry pulsed. Entire skyscrapers folded inward, vanishing into smooth pillars of light. Ships in the harbor rose silently into the air, breaking apart into glittering dust. Roads curled into arcs as if reassembled by unseen hands. Evacuees screamed as reality shifted around them. Some simply froze mid-run, suspended like mannequins before dissolving into crystalline fragments. Saskia stood her ground on the Euromast, pistol raised at a sky indifferent to her defiance. "You will not take everything," she whispered. The geometry answered with silence. Peter staggered forward, forcing the alloy drive into her hands. "This isn't only prediction. It's feedback. Every time it completes a model, it tests us against it. If we disrupt the chain just once, we break synchronization." "How?" Saskia demanded. "By being irrational." His eyes burned with fever. "By doing something no algorithm expects." Without another word, he hurled himself over the railing. His body struck the crystalline surface forming below. Instead of dissolving, it rippled, stuttering, as though the geometry could not resolve the equation of his choice. For the first time the lattice hesitated. Seizing the moment, surviving artillery unleashed a final salvo. Missiles streaked into the pulsing node above the port. The delay was seconds, maybe less, but it was enough. The node collapsed, the entire grid flickering out like a shattered hologram. The night fell silent. Rotterdam burned, broken, half-erased, but not consumed. Saskia fell to her knees, clutching the drive, tears cutting through soot. Around her, survivors rose from rubble, stunned into silence. Above, the stars returned, cold and unblinking. But she knew they were not free. The geometry had been delayed. Not destroyed. Rotterdam survived the night. But the alloys had already calculated further. This victory, like the last, was only an intermission. Official reports described Rotterdam as damaged by anomalous seismic events. The North Sea battle was marked as classified naval exercises with losses due to technical malfunction. History was rewritten while the ruins still smoldered. But fragments of the truth survived. Dr. Jeroen van Dijk compiled his notes on orbital anomalies. Commander Marieke de Boer recorded her fractured testimony of the Lunar War. Prime Minister Saskia van Alphen kept the alloy drive hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection. And somewhere, encrypted in Peter van Loon's last calculations, lay proof that human unpredictability had delayed the inevitable by fractions of time. The invaders' tools, the fractaline geometry, the hydrofractals, the masks of cognition, the terminal grid, were never designed to destroy outright. They were tests. Each device evaluated humanity's capacity to resist. Every failure fed into their models. Every anomaly, every irrational act, like Peter's self-sacrifice, registered as noise within the system. For an intelligence built on absolute mathematics, noise was intolerable. But it was also exploitable. Humanity's only defense was not strength, but error. From orbit, satellites still tracked faint lines of light crisscrossing the oceans and continents. The geometry had not gone. It had simply folded into dormancy, waiting for stability to return. The world entered an uneasy calm. Cities rebuilt, survivors were silenced, and governments cloaked the truth in layers of denial. Yet for those who had seen the lattice, the message was carved into memory. The first war had been hidden. The second was delayed. There would be a third. And this time the intermission would be shorter.